Both of my grandmothers are very light-skinned. They look white until they open their mouths, right? Uh, and so seeing their struggles and to see how they didn't fit in anywhere because they weren't black, they weren't white, and they were pretty, which was kind of a detriment in some respects. Seeing that and knowing that their stories were never going to be valued or told, other than the little bit that they would let out for us to hear as children, was disturbing for me. And more importantly, for me as a man, seeing how the scenario that my grandfather found himself in when he was drafted in the early 1940s, having never used a toothbrush, having never used an indoor toilet, having never used a radio, like he didn't know what these things were. And he was, at the time, they made the black troops pick up the cigarette butts of the white troops, and he refused. So they sent him over to the mess hall to wash dishes. And on the way to the mess hall, he saw that they were short on pilots and he needed more black pilots. So he thought to himself, it's got to be better than this. So he just signed up for it. And in that process, he discovered that basically he was a mathematical genius.
Do you know that telling a story is one of the most powerful ways to connect with your audience? Do you know that the human brain processes story much more easily and quickly than facts and figure? Stories are a great way to engage your audience, get them interested in your products and services, and inspire them to take action. A good story will help you create more compelling content that can be shared on social media or through other channels. And it's not just about telling a compelling story, it's also about knowing how to tell it effectively. Now, do you want to better connect with your audience? Then join us on our online training class, Storytelling for Content Creators and Digital Entrepreneurs. Come to obehiair14.com/storytelling and learn how to leverage your storytelling skill to earn more as a content creator and digital entrepreneur. Storytelling is a powerful way to connect with your audience, so let's explore it together. See you in the class.
And because of his abilities that were useful to the United States government, my family was allowed to prosper to a certain extent. But the man was so brilliant in that when he was well into his 80s, I could drive him to Las Vegas, which was like 3 hours from my hometown. And without using paper or pencil, he could watch the Keno machine, which is like a lottery that takes place inside the casino where you pick numbers and the numbers are drawn randomly by computer. He could see what, after watching the computer pick numbers at random for a few hours, he could determine the algorithm that the computer was using. And without using paper or pencil, he could beat the computer every time. And so this was a man who was probably the most intelligent person I've ever known. And if not for the American social order, could have been a Mercury, Gemini, or Apollo astronaut. I mean, he was that brilliant. And to see that amount of wasted potential among him, a lot of his peers, I've seen it among my parents' generation and among my generation. I'm one of very few who I grew up with who did not go to prison. And to see all of that wasted potential, that comes from a very small percentage of the population, and we are responsible for pop culture. We're responsible for so many beautiful things in this world and in this country, but then we still crowd the prisons. When I did my dissertation research at Angola State Penitentiary, a gigantic prison plantation where they make black men pick cotton for 2 cents an hour and call it rehabilitation, at the time, there were 2.1 million people incarcerated, and half of them were black males and were 7% of the population. So even with all of that detriment, as Public Enemy used to say, it takes a nation of millions to hold us back. I figured that with the time that I have and with the blessings that I have had being around stable people and knowing the better way and having taken the time to learn the beauty of our history, it has been my mission to share that with as many people as possible so that we can begin to recognize our full potential. And it does not endear me to a lot of people, but at the same time, I know that I'm going to be dead a whole lot longer than I'm going to be alive. And so it's my mission to do what I do with the greatest amount of integrity possible so that I know that that I know that when I clock out, I had a good one, as opposed to a lot of people who are just going to do what's expected of them or what's convenient. Uh, as a jazz musician in the traditional sense, you do not take the convenient route. You run to the places that are difficult. You have to, there is no success without risking failure. So you have to paint yourself into a corner and paint yourself out. It's all about how you use your mind. In the same way that, say, in Nigeria, Alegba, the way that works, mind over matter, the little guy can outthink the big guy. You can always use your wits. You can always use your ability to improvise and find the best way out of a situation to prove your soul, to prove your mettle, to prove your worth. Not necessarily how much whatever it is that you're producing can be sold for. It's like, no, what is the value? What is the intrinsic value of it? Like, is this something that your children will value? Is this something your grandchildren will value? Is this something that a child you are not related to will value because they see the beauty in it? And for me, that's the most important part of it. It's about the outcome, not the end.
Before you were saying something to the effect of sounding traditional or things like that. So I want you to expand on that. How really were you supposed to sound? Talk to me about jazz music or the kind of music that you were doing, because now you have a background in music.
Jazz music in general, well, actually, black music in the traditional sense, is based off of some 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 very potent and strong vestiges from West Africa that the Europeans could not destroy when they took our names, our language, things of that nature. Little things like syncopated rhythm, emotive delivery, uh, improvisation, polyrhythm, things that you hear in West African drum circles, things of that nature. They couldn't push that out of us all the way, and we found ways to manifest it in our cultural expressions well into the 1980s and 1990s. Uh, and and jazz is based off of these very basic principles, one of which is the blues. And so you can hear that, Billie Holiday, Coleman Hawkins, Charlie Parker, uh, all the way through Freddie King and BB King, and even new school groups like Fishbone and such. This kind of thing that comes directly from the Afro-American experience within the context of white supremacy. And it's a kind of expression that requires the ability to know your role, your ability to work within the context of an ensemble as your role is defined, and finding a way to be a cultural conduit, right? To express what it is that your role is, but also doing it in a way that differentiates you from other people who may have done that role in the past. So that's what makes you special. And it makes you a conduit because you take the language of the masters you got it from and you give it to future masters. And that's how you live in this continuum. In order to do that, you have to acknowledge that there's something bigger than you. You have to make yourself vulnerable, and you have to have a certain amount of charisma. These are things that are culturally antithetical in Western European circles. As George Michael said in the 80s, guilty feet have got no rhythm, right? You have to really give up the things that your ego, all those things have to go out of the way. You've got to give those things up, and you have to make yourself vulnerable to be this kind of cultural conduit, which most people are not really able to do unless they're raised in it. Some can, and I have worked with them. Some white people can. They are very rare. And I'm thankful for them because we're all human beings with the same capabilities, the same physical characteristics. The rest is culture, and that's human made. But if your humanity is not fully intact and you're not willing to recognize the differences in our culture without making them deficient, then you won't come you it's not going to come through. And so when these people were telling me that my sound and that my way of expression was too traditional, it was because I played blues like a guy who had been doing it since the 1920s, because that's who I learned from. I have a huge collection of Black musical recordings that go back into the 19th century all the way through the 60s and 70s that are largely unknown to most people, with the exception of, unless there's a white version of it, or unless that music was preoccupied with being acceptable to white people. Those are the things that make it through. But the other stuff doesn't, and that's the stuff that's the most beautiful. And we learned this very early. And the very first Black ensembles to tour the country came out of HBCUs, historically Black universities that were developed after the Civil War. So they had what they called Jubilee quartets, where they sang plantation melodies, hymns from Christian hymns from the gospel texts, as well as minstrel songs that were very popular, because that was the very first form of popular culture where white people would black up with burnt cork and pretend to be Black because they could release themselves in this way that was very fun, but they didn't want all the other stuff that made us beautiful. They wanted to be us so long as they could wash it off, right? And that was the way they did it. And so that was the very first form of popular culture in the United States. So most people would see that and had no other frame of context. And so they thought that that's how Black people really were. And so the very first Black people to make a living professionally as musicians had to adhere to that, which is why most of that Jubilee tradition is completely forgotten, because it has no integrity. The same with early ragtime, the very first Black theatrical music that was being sold as sheet music and into the recording era. Most of that has very little integrity because it is preoccupied with white consumption, as was Motown. Berry Gordy was very, very afraid that he would offend white people and they would not buy his records, which is why Michael Jackson left. Marvin Gaye had to record What's Going On completely in secret. And Stevie Wonder also had to threaten to leave so that he could make the music that he wanted to make. And that's how we got Talking Book, Songs in the Key of Our Life, Songs in the Key of Life, Music of My Mind, and all the beautiful recordings we know now. After he left all that bubblegum stuff that Berry Gordy was making them record, because he was afraid of what white people would do. And we have to leave that behind. Our integrity has to matter, because as these people who refuse to be accountable, who refuse to recognize that their guy lost the election and break into the Capitol and defecate in the halls of the Capitol, why are we respecting these people? We need to respect ourselves. We have spent so much time giving these people what they want. We have lost our own connection to our own history and our own humanity. And that is terrible. And I refuse. I absolutely refuse. And I belong to a very small cadre of Black people who act accordingly and are suffering as a result. I know so many potent, brilliant, beautiful, amazing Black people who are suffering because they do not adhere to this inequity.